And caught in the middle, the United States, which must promote its core values of democracy in the region while keeping its own strategic interests and Israel's security in mind.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Middle East politics were complicated to begin with, but for the US, they now seem messier than ever before.
Certainly lots to talk about here. And joining us for this round of discussion, we have Mustafa Barghouti, Secretary General of the Palestinian National Initiative and a member of the Palestinian Parliament. He is in Moscow right now. Edmond Garib, a Middle East scholar from the American University in Washington, D.C. And Dan Diker, Secretary General Designate of the World Jewish Congress in Jerusalem. Very briefly, from the three of you, how significant is the proposal put forward by President Obama when it comes to the borders between Israel and a possible Palestinian state? Professor Garib.
President Obama reiterated long-held U.S. positions, and for that matter, even some Israeli positions on this solution. He spoke about the return to the 67 borders, with some land swaps acceptable to both sides. He talked about the rise of a Palestinian state that's going to be independent, sovereign, and will have borders with Israel, with Jordan, and with Egypt, and will be a contiguous state. So in a way, the U.S. president reasserted what was generally recognized, what was advanced by Secretary Clinton last year, what was even advanced by Prime Minister Olmert as well, the previous Israeli Prime Minister.
Mr. Diker?
I think we have to make a slight correction in the facts. Mr. Obama is the first sitting U.S. president ever to publicly endorse the 1967 lines, which are the 1949 armistice lines. Those were the lines at which the Arab countries in 1948 stopped attacking Israel. There are no political borders in the West Bank, which was the former West Bank of Jordan, and therefore what Mr. Obama did was to reverse nearly 40 years of American policy not to predetermine borders for Israel that would be indefensible, leaving Israel with barely 8.5 miles of width between the Mediterranean Sea and the western border of a potential future Palestinian state. So in short, what Mr. Obama did was, by making this premature declaration, was essentially to endanger Israel's security to the east.
Mr. Barghouti?
Well, I don't understand why every Israeli spokesperson, including Mr. Netanyahu himself, keep running from the opportunity of the future to the past. Nobody wants to attack Israel. Now all Palestinians, every faction in Palestine is now putting its hand for peace with Israel based on two-state solution. We are extending our hand for peace. And nobody wants to attack Israel. Nobody is attacking Israel. Israel is occupying Palestinian territories and preventing peace based on two-state solution. Finally, an American president realized that without ending the Israeli illegal occupation of the Palestinian land, there can be no peace. The essence of what Mr. Obama said is that we need Israel to end its occupation, which has become the longest occupation in modern history for 44 years, so that there can be peace between Palestinians and Israelis.
But the question is,
if an Israeli comes out now and says that Mr. Obama is attacking Israel, that means there is a serious lack of logic here on the side of the Israel.
All right, before we go to further discussion as to whether President Obama attacked Israel or not, let's make clear, what is the understanding of the Palestinian side of the proposal put forward by President Obama? 1967 border. According to some scholars who have pointed out earlier, 1967, West Bank and East Jerusalem are belonging to Jordan, while the area like Gaza Strip was then occupied by Egypt. So what is exactly the 1967 border?
This is a question.
Are you asking me?
Mr. Garib.
Oh, The 1967 border is going back to the territories, basically the West Bank and East Jerusalem, as well as Gaza. These are the Palestinian areas. Right. Yes, it's true that Gaza was under Egyptian control, and the West Bank and East Jerusalem were under Jordanian control. But these are Palestinian territories, and this is generally what was recognized by the international community, that would be the territory that would form the Palestinian state. And in fact, despite what Mr. Netanyahu has said about generous concessions, these are not generous concessions. In fact, there are international resolutions 242, 338, which call for the return to the 67 border. And we don't hear a demand from the U.S. or from Europe for compliance, as we often heard when the case with Iraq, when the West and the international community called for compliance and later imposed sanctions and went to war. We don't see anything like that when it comes to Israel.
Okay. It is not only 1967 border, but also the agreed swaps that President Obama was talking about in his speech when it comes to the future borders, possibly between Israel and a possible Palestinian state. So what is the understanding of that agreed swap, according to you, Mr. Barghouti?
Well, I believe, I want just to remind you that Israel was established according to a United Nations resolution in 1947, which stated that two states should be established, Israel in 54% of the land and Palestine in 44% of the land. Unfortunately, Israel was established, but Palestine was never established. And we opted in 1988 to accept a huge compromise by accepting to have a state in less than half of what we should have had according to the United Nations. Now Israel exists on 78% instead of 54%. And we accept that. We accept a compromise. Israel refuses even this compromise. If they deprive us from the right of being free, if they deprive us from the right of having a state, if they deprive us from the right of freedom from occupation.
My question is, what is the agreed swaps in your understanding?
How can we have peace?
What is the agreed swaps? Are you going to agree with any kind of swaps from the Palestinian side?
I believe we don't need swaps, but if there should be swaps, these swaps should not affect the viability of the Palestinian state.
What do you mean by that?
They should be equal in size, and they should strategically have the same importance. That means that Israel cannot take away, for instance, 5% of the land and then take with it 85% of water resources that they are trying to do, and leave Palestinian territories without water.
Let's have Mr. Diker to respond.
That's very kind of you. I was falling asleep here. Let me just correct
I hope
Mr.
you're not.
Barghouti.
These are
he
very
must be on a
important
different
policies.
planet. They certainly are, but it's very nice of you to finally call on me. I'd like to correct a basic point of fact that that I'm very surprised that Mr. Barghouti got wrong, because he's such a great scholar of the Middle East. In fact, the 1967 lines were established, they were controlled by Jordan, and I'm wondering whether he thinks that Jordan was an illegal occupier of Palestinian land. He completely misquotes the 1947 partition plan, which called for two states, an Arab state and a Jewish state, Mr. Barghouti, and you know that very well. Go back and read anybody who's taken an ABC course in Middle Eastern history knows.
Before we go to that, my question for you, Mr. Diker,
is, they were talking
my
about
question for you, Mr. Diker, that is, what about the agreed swaps? Is Israel willing to do that swap, the exchange of land? How much is Israel willing to do that? According to some previous speech given by Mr. Netanyahu, your prime minister, he was indicating in the parliament that Israel would retain some of the settlement blocks. Some would criticize him inside Israel, but how much is Israel willing to go?
Let me make some context here. The whole concept of swaps was an idea that was brought about by former President Clinton together with Palestinian and Israeli interlocutors at the end of the Camp David Accords in 1999-2000. I wouldn't make such a big deal about swaps because Mr. Abbas has said that beyond 2%, there's nothing to talk about in terms of swaps. Israel must have defensible borders in order to survive in the Middle East. Israel is such a small country, it's the size of Maryland, together with the disputed West Bank, which we know in Israel as Judea and Samaria. We've been there for 3,000 years when the Palestinians weren't even anywhere in the region.
Okay.
Now they're in the region. Israel respects the Palestinian right to have a state.
So you're ready to swap or
we
not?
have to have if we have a state.
But
Israel will.
All right, before we go to you, let's have Professor Garib from Washington, D.C. Professor Garib, I'm afraid you would fall asleep if I don't call on you to comment a little bit. As you see, both sides are debating already very severely about some of the indicators President Obama gave in his speech. So many wonder, Professor Garib, why President Obama presenting all of these, which might be negotiation tactic, yet now already heightened it to the U.S. foreign policy level?
I think there are a number of reasons why the president decided to speak right now. First of all, I think although he's talking about resetting U.S. foreign policy, I think the events in the Middle East, the popular uprisings which have taken place in the region are putting a lot of pressure on the United States. U.S. influence has diminished. In fact, U.S. credibility has gone down. The people of the Middle East are no longer having the same kind of expectations, especially they realize that there is a gap, a big gap, between rhetoric and reality when it comes to U.S. policy, and in fact, President Obama's policy. Also, the killing of Osama bin Laden, also had an impact. So the president wanted to show that he's still serious about the peace issue. He knows that this is the core issue for most of the people in the Middle East, and he also wanted to catch up to the events in the Arab streets, and particularly the Arab Spring.
But some have been complaining, Professor Garib, that with this specific plan, it seemed that President Obama presented in his speech, he ignored his previous promise of a deadline for a real plan by September. Do you agree with those?
Oh, absolutely. I think that's one of the problems. This was not really, however, to be fair to the president, I don't think he was providing a roadmap or even a specific contours of a deal between the Israelis and the Palestinians. He was emphasizing basic principles which had been recognized by the international community and by both sides. As today, the envoy, U.S. peace envoy George Mitchell said that, in fact, basically this is the previous stand. What President Obama repeated was the stand of the U.S., the stand of Israel, so there was nothing really new in this. In fact, it did not, it focused a great deal on Israeli security and did not focus enough on Palestinian suffering and occupation.
So what is the purpose of this plan specifically this time?
I think basically he wanted to show that he's still active. He wanted to catch up. He wanted to tell people in the Islamic world and in the Arab world that the United States continues to be supportive, especially after the resignation of his envoy, George Mitchell, who resigned because he was not getting sufficient support in Washington.
Mr. Diker, how do you see the recent events going on in the Arab world, mainly the oppositions trying to topple down the longtime rulers, influencing in any way the U.S. policies toward the Palestinian and the Israeli issues?
First of all, I think we have to separate what's happening in the larger Middle East from the Palestinian issue. There are constantly attempts by our Palestinian colleagues to connect, and even by some in the West, to connect the two, saying that the Palestinian issue is the core issue in the Middle East. It absolutely is different than that. In fact, you don't really hear the words Palestinian-Israeli conflict coming up in the capitals of the Middle East. The people of Tunisia, the people of Syria, the people of Cairo are about as interested in the Palestinians as they are in the Pope. They're interested in getting rid of corrupt dictators that they were suffering under for many years. And in fact, one of the sore spots to many Palestinians, which they don't like to admit publicly, is that the Arab world doesn't really give too much of a darn about the Palestinians, including paying up their pledges to help the Palestinian people. The only country in the world, besides the United States, that has made the largest financial commitment to the Palestinians has been their neighbors, the Israelis. There was a time, that there were 300,000 Palestinians a year that used to work in Israel, and in fact, most Israelis would probably be very happy if Palestinians came back.
I'm sure both sides have a lot to say about what each other's what each other would mean for each other. But let's talk about this. I mean, the Hamas and Fatah has now reconciled, but Israel still do not want to talk to Hamas because it did not recognize Israel's existence rights. So for the next step, if there's any negotiation between the two sides, will Israel talk to the other side, talk to Hamas? Very briefly, and then we go to Mr.
Let me be very...
Yeah. Go ahead, Mr. Diker.
Let me be very clear. The Hamas is the local Palestinian chapter of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Hamas was the first organization to praise bin Laden and to criticize the United States for killing bin Laden. The Hamas is dedicated to the destruction of the State of Israel.
So you're willing to talk or not willing to talk?
They claim it in their mandate, and they are religiously committed to destroying Israel.
So the
that
conclusion
is a clear fact, and they are considered a terrorist organization. They are considered a terrorist organization by the European Union and the United States.
So you don't have any conclusions here. Let's go to Mr. Barghouti.
Yes, of course we have. No, the conclusion is that the same way that Al Qaeda is a terrorist organization, the United States will not negotiate with.
Your words are being heard. Let's go to Mr. Barghouti.
The State of Israel, the Jewish people,
Mr. Barghouti,
will not negotiate with Hamas in the same way that the United States will not negotiate with bin Laden.
Maybe you should ask your guest to stop talking. What I'm trying to say is that the United States cannot speak. Mr. Obama finds it illogical, of course, to speak about freedom and democracy in Libya, Syria, and Egypt, and Tunisia without speaking about freedom and democracy for Palestinians. It doesn't make sense. That's why he finds himself obliged to speak about the Palestinian issue. And when we speak about peace here, we are speaking about equal rights. Israel speaks about its security. Okay, Israel should have security, but Palestinians also should have security. They say that Israel is a very small state. I remind him that Israel is will be four times the size of the Palestinian state. So Israel has the fifth largest military power in the world. It has more than 400 nuclear heads. We have not a single army.
All right.
So we need also security and we need protection. We cannot have peace unless we accept each other on the basis of equal human rights, on the basis of equal human beings.
As I said, both sides have a lot to say, but before we go, let's go to Professor Garib in Washington, D.C.
Has to stop talking about the past.
All right. We have a lot to say, of course, for this discussion, but let's go to Professor Garib for the final words. It seems that both are debating very hard about the next step, whether there is going to be any next step. Meanwhile, domestically, President Obama is facing a lot of pressure from the Jewish community. He's going to run for presidential elections. The funding might be coming a lot from the contribution from Jewish community. What kinds of pressure do you think he's facing, both inside the country and also foreign policy-wise?
Clearly, the President Obama is under a lot of pressure from the region where there is going to be, in fact, more demands by Arab publics and Muslim publics, and for that matter, by the international community to fulfill his promises about ending the settlements, about helping to achieve a just and peaceful settlement between the Israelis and the Palestinians. In the United States, clearly, as you pointed out, he's coming under a lot of pressure from supporters of Israel, from the Israel lobby, AIPAC, and in fact he's speaking to them today probably at this time. And so he has been put under pressure from donors who have said that they may not provide support. Clearly, I think President Obama, however, has a great deal of support within the Jewish community. There is a difference between the Jewish community in the United States. The majority of Jews, 54%, in fact, according to polls, have supported the president president, but it is the leaders of the lobby, of the special interest groups, plus their support in Congress, which is putting a lot of pressure on the President of the United States to continue to support the policies of the hardliners in Israel.
Before we go, one sentence from every one of you. Very short sentence. We are running out of time, gentlemen. One short sentence from every one of you to say something about what do you think needs to be done before the peaceful negotiation process can move forward. One sentence, very short. Let's start from Mr. Barghouti. Very short, please.
I think Israel has to change. Israel has to accept the right of the Palestinians to be free and independent. Israel has to stop the longest occupation in modern history, which has become an apartheid. And Israel does not need to speak to Hamas. Now Mr. Abbas can talk on behalf of all Palestinians.
Mr. Diker.
Israel cannot continue
Mr.
to
Diker,
say,
please.
We can't speak to you because you don't represent all Palestinians, but now we can't speak to you because you represent all Palestinians. Israel has to change and accept peace and equality and democracy.
All right, Mr. Diker.
I think Mr. Barghouti knows that the vast majority of Israelis want very much to have peace with their Palestinian neighbors. If the Palestinians make the reckless and irresponsible move of declaring and getting endorsement for a Palestinian state in the United Nations, it will end their bid for statehood, and they will never have a state if they make this move, because Israel will never move from its positions.
Professor
Come back to the negotiating table, negotiate as 5 governments did in the past since 1993, and you will find we will find ourselves in a peaceful negotiating environment.
Professor Garib.
Can I speak now?
Professor Garib, go
I
ahead.
think clearly Israel and the Palestinians cannot do it on their own. You have an occupier and an occupied people, and they need international help. There is need for the international community to play an effective role and to comply with internationally recognized resolutions which call for peace for land.
Admam Garib, Mustafa Barghouti, and also Dan Diker. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Thank you for your participation.